Alright, so today I'm not particularly short on time, but I wanted to go ahead and do another checkpoint since it had been a while. Something very important that's changed is my perception of the fundamentals, which is why this checkpoint 2 is organized differently than checkpoint 1. I've also realized that if I list everything under each category all the time, eventually the checkpoint documents and videos will get incredibly long. So instead, I might look to compare against the previous one, but for the most part, I'll just be noting things that I've learned since the last. So since then, routing and looting have been split up. Routing is considered out-of-game planning, and some of the things that I think I've learned since block 4, in blocks 5 through 11, is just better ways to recognize how fast a build is coming online. Previously, I thought that finishing builds by the end of night 1 seemed pretty good. Even with this metric, though, the tankier Cathy build I had was a bit slow, and I think as a result, it kind of became more of a ratting build because it was a much bulkier Cathy than before. But the build took so long to come online that usually I at least felt like I was much weaker than everyone else. And so I was a much weaker character with a lot of move speed and tank stats and a pretty good amount of food, which kind of just left me in a position where I would have to rat a lot. Just avoid all fights, kind of look for placement and stuff like that. Something interesting that I looked over, which I hope I spelled this right, is Shubi Senpai's notes on one of their lead island builds. Specifically, they had a lot of notes for kind of the expected time to be arriving at zones. And that let me realize that, even by my previous standards of finishing build it by end of day 1, that standard itself seemed a little bit slow. And it could be that lead islands can loot a bit faster, and so maybe their standards are a bit different than for Cathy's. But I chose to, I don't know. I decided that, even with my current speeds, things were a bit slow. Another thing I recognize is the importance of minimal looting. So this is basically just recognizing what components you can skip in a zone, so that if you end up looting, an area and it would cost a lot more time to loot anything else, you're able to decide, okay, I know I'm missing some components, but they're not for my most important items, so I'm just gonna teleport out of here or walk out of here or whatever, so that you can continue on with the build. I had a lot of cases where I would spend sometimes an extra minute, so going from 50 seconds to around 2 minutes in the starting zone, just because I was trying to find everything. And so this right here really helped me speed things up a lot. Additionally, I did a new 4-zone build based on crit, and have since then learned kind of the importance of routing good food. My previous build just happened to have mocha bread and HP potions as something that were pretty easy to craft, but this 4-zone build has had a lot of problems with me just not having food. Additionally, rocks and twigs are much less free than I originally thought. The 4-zone build calls for 2 harvests of twigs and 2 harvests of rocks, so 4 rocks in total. And I've had a lot of times where I had to go really out of my way to find the twigs and rocks. And some of this could be alleviated by better routing and factoring in when I can actually get twigs and rocks, areas where that's more convenient. But in my case, I never really found an opportunity to get all the twigs and rocks I needed. At best, my first zone had 1 thing of twigs, 1 thing of rocks near the teleporter, and so that helped stabilize the build a lot. But overall, I think this is an important lesson that the twigs and rocks definitely need to be considered more than I had been considering them before. I know previously I learned more about wolves and leather routing, but the build that I've been using more recently happens to avoid that issue by not requiring. So perhaps I'll get a bit better at that by the time I do the next check. So for looting, well, looting I've decided is kind of the in-game execution of the route planning and any kind of on-the-fly unexpected adaptations to the routing. So important things here are pivot zones, which I'm just calling zones that you can go to if you need to concede a zone. So let's say there's a lot of fighting by much stronger characters there. Going in there is basically a death sentence. And so it's better to just pivot to new zones instead. Factory has been a pretty common pivot for me since it has both scrap metal and glue, both of which can be pretty limited sometimes and have caused me a lot of issues. Another thing that I think is a bit important is just sitting on components when I don't need to be crafting. This helps both with looting speed and survivability. It helps with looting speed because I can just spend more time looting boxes rather than sitting down and crafting, while other people might be taking things from boxes I'll be going to in the future. It helps with survivability because crafting can make noise, and I've had some cases where people realized where I was and started chasing after me. The other thing is that it just costs time, and especially if you're in a zone where there are threats against you, taking that extra time to craft can be the difference between being able to teleport out and not. Another thing is that timer is a resource. I was noticing that in a lot of my games, I would die, and I wouldn't have used my timer at all for anything. Not for crafting, not for looting, not for escaping. And I think there's some potential here to use timer as a resource for looting, more so than I have been doing. Crafting, I realized that, ice plus water is a very, very efficient SP item, mostly because it's pretty easy to do and gets a lot more value than just water by itself. Vision, I didn't really focus on. I don't remember learning in particular. Previously, I happened to find out that dagger skill and some other invisibility gets revealed by cameras, but I haven't had any such new information about vision. Hunting. Looking over my VODs, I was realizing that probably the main reason I was really, really far behind in mastery is just because I stopped hunting. I recognized that in game, intuitively, I felt like my mastery would keep going up, just because it does in the early game. But in reality, that's caused by just crafting the weapons. And so I've been trying to hunt a bit more, just if it's convenient. But I think there's still some more work to do here. Although another part too was just that because I couldn't fight people, I couldn't get mastery that way either. So threat assessment. Threat assessment is a fundamental I discovered / thought of between the last checkpoint and this one. Basically, I recognize that understanding who you can fight is a very important skill in this game. And a lot of the times I was dying, it was because I started fighting someone without really considering where they were in the game. Dying to a lot of, Yukis with one of the legendary weapons and, mithril stuff and a bunch of other things like that. Or, people with halos when I still didn't have my build finished, stuff like that. And so, to help with that fundamental, I started using what I'm calling the quick check method, which is basically just using the key that does the information overlay that shows each character's weapon rarity and their mastery level. The weapon rarity in particular helps in the early game because it lets you see whether or not they've finished weapon or not. Mastery is more important later because it gives somewhat of an approximation of how much they've been fighting people a lot of the time, since that's one of the key ways to get mastery. Another thing is that I've been checking with tab more. The main thing that this lets you do that quick checking doesn't is it lets you see what their actual items are. In the case where people have finished weapons but not farmed or attacked much, you can't actually tell a difference between someone who's full build and someone who's only sitting on a few items, just from the quick check. And then combat. I've had a few games where I've just generally been doing better with the crit build. I think it's probably just higher damage. And I've been using my E a lot better too. And then escaping. Escaping is another fundamental I added. And basically just reiterating the importance that timer is a resource. And especially since I'm not making it to Final Zone that much, I have more reason to just be a bit liberal, I think, with my timer usage. And I think that's basically it for now. There may be a few things I forgot, but I did try to flip through some of my notes for previous blocks. Maybe in the future I'll do a bit more editing with these videos, since it's probably not too interesting to be looking at a text editor the entire time. But I do think it's important to have all this information here. People can read if they're really interested. And as always, if you made it to the end of my video, thank you very much for watching, and I hope you come back.